Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to get started. Hi, my name is Bryony Hunt. I'm the Community Influencing Manager at Samaritans Cymru, and I've been asked today to come and talk to you about what we do at Samaritans, and I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about being compassionate, what that looks like, how to spot the signs of emotional distress in somebody else, and how we can use listening and conversation skills to support people. And then I'll share some information about the resources we've got at Samaritans that you might find useful for yourself. And we'll end with a short clip on someone who has accessed help and something that's a bit more hopeful. So I'm just going to share some slides and then we'll get started. Okay. So today we're going to talk about who are Samaritans, why we're here, what is compassion, why it's important, emotional distress and suicidal feelings, listening and acting compassionately, and then finally some stories of hope. So before we get started, I just want to say it's really important that you look after yourselves in this session. We will be talking a little bit about suicide and self-harm. It won't be anything in detail. I don't talk about it for long, but there will be references to suicide and self-harm and emotional distress throughout the webinar. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. If you need to take a break, please do take a break from your computer. Go and get a cup of tea. If you need support afterwards, I'm going to be sharing details of our Samaritans helpline, so you can ring them anytime. Or if you've got a support network around you, then remember to reach out to them as well. We're talking about compassion with other people, but show compassion to yourself as well, and just make sure that you're keeping yourself safe throughout the session. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask some questions. There's a Q&A box, but there's also a chat box as well. And if you want to pop things in there throughout the session, then when we come to the end, we can go through those. Okay, so who are Samaritans? So hopefully you've joined this because you're interested in Samaritans, you know a little bit about Samaritans already. We are a charity operating in the UK and Ireland. So I work for Samaritans Cymru, but we are all part of the same Samaritans in the UK. And our vision at Samaritans is that fewer people die by suicide. So to do this, we believe that Samaritans has a crucial role to play in reducing the risk factors that make some people more likely to take their own lives, ensuring that people who are at increasing risk of suicide are supported, making it less likely that people who do experience suicidal thoughts act on them, and reducing the likelihood that people will develop suicidal thoughts. So one way we do this is through our helpline. So Samaritans are here day or night for anybody who's struggling to cope. We operate a free and anonymous helpline. So that's open 24/7 on the number 116123. That's free for everybody, including if you've got pay-as-you-go phone and you don't have credit on there, and it will not show up on your phone bill. So if you want to ring Samaritans, or if someone else wants to ring Samaritans and they're worried about it showing up on a phone bill, it doesn't come up on there. So you can ring us without having those worries. And we answer a call for help every 10 seconds. So that includes calls to our helpline, but we also have an email hub, a letter writing service, and we're currently piloting a chat service. And our helpline, lots of people don't know, but it's run by volunteers all over the UK. So we've got around 23,000 Samaritans volunteers. They're all incredible people who work day and night to answer those phone calls. And our volunteers, they provide a listening service. So they won't give advice or guidance, and it'll become a bit more clear in my next slide why that is. But they are there to listen to callers about whatever they're going through. So people can ring us about absolutely anything. Lots of people think that it just has to be related to suicide or self-harm, but that's not the case at all. People can ring us because they're having a bad day, because you've been at work and you've had a tough conversation. It might be something more serious like suicide and self-harm related. It could be a relationship breakdown, financial problems, anything that is serious to you that is affecting you, you can call us and talk to us about it. So to give you a little bit of a background, Samaritans was founded 70 years ago by Chad Vara, and he was a rector in the City of London. And he'd conducted a funeral of a 14-year-old girl who had taken her own life. So when he interviewed to become a rector, then further in his career, he had done some preparation and read that there was 3 suicides a day in Greater London. So he decided that he wanted to start a 999 for potential suicides. And they used to call him the one man with one phone. And he dedicated his entire life to helping others who felt like they had nowhere else to turn. So his idea was that he wanted to help people find a way to help themselves on their own terms. So that's why Samaritans is a listening service, because he believed that simply listening to another person was really empowering and would help them find their own way. And Samaritans was the first round-the-clock listening service to be set up in the UK and Republic of Ireland. And like I said, we are celebrating our 70th year anniversary this year, which is really exciting. And something I always like to mention is that sometimes people think that Samaritans is a religious organisation because of the name, but actually the media were the ones who coined the term Samaritans after the parable of the Good Samaritan. But despite that, Samaritans are not a religious organisation. We are non-establishment, so you don't need to have any religious background or anything like that. We're not religious. We don't try to push religion. We're completely open to everybody, and we're a non-establishment organisation. So what do we do in Wales then? So in Wales, we are known as Samaritans Cymru. As I said, we're part of the UK Samaritans, but we are a small team of 5 staff members, and we focus on influencing local and national policy, working with different communities to let them know that we are here for them and that there is help out there. And we also do some work on the railways, preventing suicide and promoting our training and supporting rail staff with those issues on the railways. In Wales, we have just over 700 amazing dedicated volunteers who run our helpline. They also provide community outreach, they raise awareness, and they run sessions in places like workplaces, schools, colleges, and other settings. So we do a lot of work in Wales, a lot of it's helped by our volunteers, and we really try to get out there and let people know that we are there for them. We do also have a Welsh language line, which is run in Wales. So our English line is run all over the UK. And if you call our line, you could get through to somebody in Manchester, for example. It won't be someone local to you necessarily. But if you ring our Welsh language line, it goes to one of our Welsh branches. And that is not 24/7, but it is open 4 hours a day, 7 till 11 p.m. And I will share the number with you in a second. The exact same service is just available in the Welsh language if you're a Welsh speaker and you feel more comfortable speaking in that language. So what happens when people talk to us or contact us? So if you ring Samaritans, you ring the number 116123 or the Welsh language line number, and the exact same happens. A volunteer will answer and they'll say something like, "Samaritans, can I help you?" And then you are allowed to talk about whatever you need to talk about. We are there to listen. So our volunteers will help you to talk through any concerns or worries or troubles that you have, and they'll give you that space to be yourself and to take your time. You don't need to be rushed. You don't need to feel like you don't need to get it all out. Some people will ring us and they will struggle with what to say, and our volunteers are there to ask open questions and prompt you to discuss your thoughts and feelings. So they might ask some questions, but they'll never ask you leading questions or make suggestions. Like I said, we are a listening service, so we will never tell you what to do. We won't make any decisions for you. We won't give our advice or opinions because we don't feel that that's important for the call. And our volunteers, you know, they won't have spoken to you before necessarily, so they won't know that background to give you that advice or guidance. So we really do focus on listening. We can signpost to other organisations if that's requested. So if you ring us and say that you're concerned about your finances and you want to know where to go to get some advice for that, we can suggest some services for you. And just to give you kind of a bit of insight into what people call us for. So like I said, we're not just there for people who are feeling suicidal, but we do get calls from people who are feeling suicidal or discussing self-harm. But last year, the primary concerns that people called us about were related to mental health problems or illnesses, family issues, isolation and loneliness, and relationship problems. So a real range of issues that people called us about. So in terms of how to contact us, I've mentioned the number 116123, and our Welsh language line is 0808 164 0123, and that's open from 7 till 11 p.m. every single night. If you prefer not to talk to somebody on the phone, you'd prefer to email us, we have an email address, joe@samaritans.org. They will take slightly longer to respond to emails and letters. It won't be instant, but you will still get a response, and it will still be the listening service that you would receive on the phone. Or you can write us a letter, which is free post Samaritans letters. We are piloting the chat service at the minute as well. So depending on the outcome of the pilot, we hope that that will become available as well as another method that people can get in touch with us. So that is the information I wanted to give you about contacting Samaritans. And now I want to move on to thinking about how we can support other people, what that looks like, and what emotional distress and suicidal feelings look like in people who are struggling. So we're going to talk about compassion. Lots of us will have used the word compassion or talked about compassion, but sometimes we don't really think about what compassion means. So compassion is based on empathy, respect, dignity. So whereas empathy is the ability to put yourself in another person's place and understand their distress, compassion has kind of an additional element of actively wanting to help that person. So it's empathy, but with an addition. And it's the ability to understand and to sympathise with the emotional state of another person, whilst also having that kind of internal motivation to help and prevent their distress. And so that's how we show compassion to people, is being able to understand them, but wanting to help them then as well. And the compassion we show to other people can really affect how we perceive our interactions with individuals, with services, and showing compassion can really make people feel valued and cared for. So it's really important. And most importantly, showing compassion, not only to other people, but to ourselves as well, is a skill that can be learned. So if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not a particularly compassionate person, or you're thinking about someone else who's not particularly compassionate, it is something that can be learned. And what I'm going to go through in my talk is kind of how we can show compassion to other people. But we can also show compassion to ourselves as well, and that's really important to remember. It doesn't require any specific resource, it doesn't require time, doesn't require money. It just relies on you being able to relate to somebody else's emotional state, and very crucially, then wanting to support them. So the most important thing to remember when it comes to being compassionate and to wanting to help somebody else is that you do not need to be an expert to help someone who's experiencing distress. You don't need to know loads about the topic or what they're talking about. You don't need to have experienced it yourself. You just need to have that willingness to listen and to show that compassion. But the most valuable thing that we can show people is that they're not alone and that they know somebody cares. And when we're thinking about kind of other people, and, you know, we all need support at times, and we tend to assume that most people have family or friends that are able to support them. And those people might be able to offer emotional support or financial support or whatever other support that they need. But I think it's important to remember that there's quite a significant number of us who don't have that. They don't have that support network. They might have family and friends around them, but maybe they don't feel comfortable going them for support, or maybe they are quite isolated or lonely and they just don't have that support around them. So lots of people do have very little or no social support at all. And they could be experiencing loneliness and isolation, which can then have a big impact on our physical and mental health. So lots of people just don't feel like they really have anybody to talk to. So that's why it's so important that we learn how to be compassionate and to show compassion to other people at any time. Because we might not actually be aware that we're helping somebody, but for some people, being shown that compassion will make a huge difference. And I really like this quote on the screen. So helping a person will not necessarily change the world, but it can change the world for that person. And I think that's really important to remember, because, you know, simply just being there for somebody, listening to somebody, or just offering them that kind of compassionate response can make a huge difference. And we might not walk away from that thinking we haven't really done much, but we never really truly know how much that means to that person. And we can't always see it, but you're probably aware of this, but 1 in 4 people are affected by mental health problems. So most of us will know someone, whether it's ourselves, a family member, a friend, or a colleague who lives with a mental health problem. And so that's another reason why it's so important that we show compassion to people, because we never really know, unless that person tells us, we never really know what people are going through and whether somebody is struggling or not. And I think, it's fair to say that we all have times in our lives where we're presented with difficult situations or in a tricky, challenging situation, or we're struggling with our mental health. And so we can kind of empathize with what feeling distressed and struggling to cope looks like. And I'm sure you can probably think of a time where someone showed you compassion, or when compassion would have been really helpful to you. So those are just some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about supporting other people. So this slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about who is at risk of emotional distress, and particularly suicidal feelings. So like I said, we can all experience emotional distress, and we can all experience suicidal feelings as well. And these feelings will have a range of causes. So I think it's important for me to say that there is no single reason why people take their own lives. Often we'll try and kind of find that reason, or to suggest that there was one cause. But what we find is that suicide is really complex, and there's very often no single cause for why someone would take their own life. But there are risk factors, and there are groups which we call kind of high-risk groups, who are more likely to experience emotional distress or suicidal feelings because of those associated factors by being in those groups. So I'm just going to pull these groups up so you can see them all, and I will talk through a couple of them. So as you can see, there's a lot of groups on that slide. And some people might be in one group, some people might be in multiple of these. It doesn't mean that, we're not suggesting that these people in these groups will have suicidal feelings or act on those, but it just means that they're a bit higher risk because of these groups. So, for example, we've got people who've been bereaved by suicide. That could be very recently, or it could be years ago. They will always come under the group of being bereaved by suicide, and they will be at slightly higher risk. And when we say bereaved by suicide, it doesn't matter how close that person was to you. It doesn't have to be an immediate family. It could be a friend, or a colleague, or someone you knew that has died by suicide. We've got groups like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. Tends to be that group of people will be at higher risk of emotional distress and suicidal feelings for a few different reasons, really. So, for example, feeling isolated or lonely. If someone is in the process of figuring out their sexuality and they haven't told anybody yet, that can be quite isolating. But also we find that people in this group struggle with access to healthcare, and that can contribute to those things as well. We've also got men in there. You will see a couple of times men is mentioned, so young men and middle-aged men. And we know that middle-aged men in particular are at higher risk of suicide. It can be for different factors. Everybody's individual. We often find that historically, men don't talk as much or access services as much as maybe women would. I think that is getting better, and there's lots of improvements in that, and there's more services out there now that are particularly targeted at males. There's specific occupational groups, so groups like doctors, nurses, vets, farmers, and agricultural workers. This tends to be because they're exposed to a lot of intense situations that are quite emotionally draining. If you think about some of the situations a doctor or a vet might be in or see, they can be quite traumatic as well. But also these occupational groups do have a wider access to the means of suicide as well. So that's what puts them in a slightly higher risk. And then we have, I apologise if you can hear my dog barking. I think the doorbell is about to go. We have people with a history of self-harm, people who have experienced substance misuse, mental health problems, or those who are feeling lonely and isolated. And then we also have people who are in contact with the criminal justice system, and particularly prisoners tend to be at high risk of suicide. So we have got in Samaritans, we've got a prisoners listening scheme where we go into prison and we train some of the prisoners to be listeners and to provide that support. And people in prison have also got access to call our helpline as well. So we're focused on that group. And, you know, looking at all these groups, it's really important that we're aware of these so we can work with different communities and different groups of people to make sure that we've got prevention systems in place. And so part of my role as community influencing manager is to work with particular high-risk groups and communities in Wales to look at how we can increase suicide prevention efforts, and particularly just let people know that we are there for them and there is support out there. There is also, and it's not on this slide, but there is also a connection between poverty and suicide in the UK. So suicide rates are about 2 to 3 times higher in the most deprived areas compared to the most affluent. And we found that admissions to hospital following self-harm incidences are also 2 times higher in the most deprived areas compared to the most affluent. So suicide risk also increases during periods of economic recession. So again, we see that link there between suicide risk and poverty. But what I really want to reiterate is that it's important to know these things, and it's important for us to be aware of groups that are at higher risk of suicide so we can do more to help people in these groups. But I want to reiterate, there is no single cause for suicide. And whilst being in these groups would put someone at higher risk, we are not suggesting that those people will necessarily think about, attempt or die by suicide. It's just that we need to be aware that we need to be making support services available to people who are in these groups and the wider people outside of these. So we're going to do a bit of myth busting. When it comes to things like mental health problems, emotional distress, and suicide and self-harm, they're quite often very misunderstood topics, and lots of the time it has a lot of stigma attached to them. So it's really important that we know our facts, and that can help us to understand other people and understand ourselves as well, and just show compassion again towards other people. So everything on this slide is a myth, and I'm going to tell you why. So number 1, mental health problems are really rare. So I think, as I said in the last section, mental health problems affect 1 in 4 people. So someone everybody knows, someone we know is very likely to have experienced a mental health problem, whether it's yourself or somebody else. But that's actually quite common, 1 in 4 people. So it is all around us, and it's important that we talk about these things to reduce the stigma. And I think we are getting a lot better at that, but they are actually quite common. Number 2 is that if a person is serious about killing themselves, there's nothing that you can do. So it's important to recognise that feeling actively suicidal is very often temporary. Even if someone has been feeling very low or anxious or struggling to cope for a long period of time, it's often a temporary feeling because that person feels like there's no other way. But if we can help them to get the right support at the right time, it's really important, because that means that they might then build that hope for the future, and those feelings of suicide will go away and they will know that there's support available. So that's why it's so important that the right support at the right time is there. And that's what we're trying to work to do at Samaritans, is make sure that people know that that support is there and suicide is not the answer for them. Number 3 is that talking about suicide is a bad idea, as it may give someone the idea to try it. So suicide, as you probably know, can sometimes be seen as a bit of a taboo topic in society. There's a bit of stigma attached to it, and people are often quite afraid of using the word suicide and talking about it. And often I think people feeling suicidal don't want to worry or kind of burden anybody with how they feel, so they don't discuss it either. But we really encourage asking directly about suicide and using the word suicide, because if you ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, we're giving them permission to tell us how they feel. And that's often what people need. We found that people who have felt suicidal will often say what a huge relief it is to be able to talk about what they're experiencing. So once someone starts talking about it, they've got a much better chance of getting the support they need then, because their options are open and they're talking to somebody. And sometimes articulating it can just really help that person to get their thoughts in order as well, and understand, what is going on and what they need support with. So it's not a bad idea. You won't put the idea of suicide in somebody's head by using the word or talking about it. It's actually something that we would encourage doing. And then finally, we've got people who threaten suicide are just seeking attention and shouldn't be taken seriously. So people who say that they are feeling suicidal should always be taken seriously. We should always take someone seriously if they tell us they're feeling suicidal or they're having thoughts of suicide. It might well be that that person does want attention, but it's in the sense of calling out for help, that they're asking for support, and asking attention could ultimately save their life. So it is really, really important that we take people seriously when they're talking about suicide. Okay. So you might be thinking, okay, well, how do I know somebody is struggling? So I'm going to talk through some of the signs of emotional distress. And I just want to say, sometimes it's not always possible to identify people who are going through emotional distress because they might not show any of these signs. But there are some signs and behaviours that we can look out for that might indicate somebody is experiencing poor mental health. And these are also signs that you can look for in yourself as well. So if you're struggling and you're noticing some of these behaviours, it might be a sign that you need to get some support, whether that's going to your GP or it's calling a helpline like Samaritans or going to a community organisation where they can support you. But these are things that work both ways. It's in others and in ourselves as well. And what I would say is that any change in behaviour that's unusual for that person that you're thinking of would indicate that something might be going on. It might be that you've got it wrong and they're not struggling, but sometimes it's better to ask than to just avoid these things. So first of all, things like if someone's lacking energy or appearing particularly tired, so maybe it looks like they haven't slept or they're just looking really unmotivated, looking withdrawn, then that's one sign that things might be going on. Someone might be appearing more tearful, they might be crying more. Crying it's not always a sign, or being tearful is not always a sign that someone is struggling. They might, not look like they've cried, but it is a sign that, and quite a clear sign, I suppose, that somebody has been crying about something. So that's something to look out for. Not wanting to talk or be with people, again, withdrawing yourself from people if that's unusual for that person, or not wanting to do things that they usually enjoy. So if someone's got lots of hobbies and they suddenly decided that they don't want to do them anymore, or they don't really enjoy them, they're not interested, there might be something else going on there that's causing that. Now, we say a change in routine, and this can kind of be either way. So when you think of sleeping, it might be that you or somebody else is sleeping more or sleeping less. So if you normally get kind of 8 hours sleep a night and now you're getting 3, or you normally get 8 hours sleep and now you're sleeping all day. And the same goes for eating. So eating more or eating less. Some people, when they're feeling distressed and they're feeling emotional, they stop eating completely. If you're like me, you will eat everything in sight. So it depends on that person and how they cope with things. But eating more or less or sleeping more or less can generally be like a behavioural sign that something's going on for someone. Using alcohol or drugs to cope with feelings, particularly in people who don't necessarily behave like that anyway. You might notice that someone might drink regularly, but then suddenly they're drinking in excess, or they're using other substances to kind of mask their feelings or cope with those things. And you might notice somebody is finding it hard to cope with kind of small everyday things. So maybe someone at work who normally is pretty calm, they don't get stressed much, and then suddenly they're finding everything really hard and every interaction with someone is difficult, or they're just finding it difficult to cope with everyday conversations or things that come up in life in general that they don't normally find difficult to cope with. They might then appear quite restless or agitated. That might come across in the way that they're conversing with you, or the way that they're reacting to people, or they might just kind of physically be restless and agitated. One thing that we can spot in looking in somebody is when somebody doesn't look like they're taking care of themselves. So you might notice somebody is maybe looking like a bit more disheveled than they used to. You know, they might normally look quite well put together, and suddenly they're looking like they're not sleeping much, and they're looking like they haven't really kind of done anything to get themselves ready in the morning. And they might also say, you know, that they feel like they don't matter, or there's no point in these things. Another thing that is always a surprising one is if somebody becomes quite untypically clumsy or accident prone. So they're maybe not concentrating as much, they're falling over, they're dropping things, they're just not, it's kind of a sign that they're not really kind of concentrating on what they're doing, that maybe their thoughts are somewhere else, and suddenly they're kind of just, becoming really clumsy, dropping things, tripping over, bumping into people, because they're not really focused on what's going on in the moment. And then finally, things like becoming withdrawn or losing touch with our friends and family. So if you know somebody who goes out to see their friends and family quite a lot, or maybe they don't, but you know, they keep in touch, and suddenly you don't hear from them, or they are not coming out, or they're cancelling plans, there might be a reason for that. So there's a lot of things I covered there, and a lot of these things are, you know, dependent on the person. So it's really about kind of whether it's a change in behavior for that person. You know, if there's someone who normally kind of doesn't really show an interest in talking to other people, then them not doing that might not be a red flag for you, because that's their normal behavior. But if it's suddenly kind of a change in behavior for someone, then that might be a prompt for us to check in that they're okay. And the same goes for yourself as well. If you're noticing any of these things in yourself, and you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm not been feeding myself lately, I don't really want to go out, I'm not enjoying the things that I'm doing, or you know, I've been sleeping a lot less, and I've been eating a lot more, and I'm just not interested in anything, then that's a sign, I suppose, to look inward and think, maybe I need to get some support and check that I'm okay, because these can be signs in ourselves as well. And these are things that we can look out for in people, but they're also things that people will say that might help us recognize that they're struggling to cope. So they might make statements, like leading statements, things like, you wouldn't believe what I've been through, or it's like the whole world is against me. So they're suggesting there, within those words, that something else is going on, and they think people are against them, or they've been through something. So again, that's a sign, you know, that maybe something else is going on, and we need to ask them how they're doing. They might also make negative statements about themselves, or about other people, other things that are going on. So things like, oh, no one likes me, or I'm a waste of space. Even if someone sounds like they're joking, saying those things, you know, it's worth checking in and saying, do you really mean that? Or is everything okay? Because sometimes people will say these things in the hope that someone will pick up on them and ask them what they mean, so they can talk about it. So it's just always worth looking out for these things, to check in, to see if there's anything that we can be picking up on to prompt us having a conversation with someone. So hopefully that's given you a good idea of the things that you can look out for, either in yourselves or in other people, that might be signs that they are struggling. And now we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, how can we respond to that? How can we show that compassion and show that we're listening to people? So first of all, we're going to talk about kind of acting compassionately in terms of like starting a conversation. And I'm going to share some conversation tips with you to think about how we might start this. And just to say, this is not about becoming an expert or being, you know, acting like a therapist or becoming a professional. It's just about everyday things that we can do, anybody can do, and anybody can learn, to just make sure that we're kind of looking out for other people. So these tips I'm going to share with you, they're kind of ways to get someone to open up and to help someone open up. And you might feel like you don't know how to help them because you don't know how to solve their problems, but it's not about solving someone's problems. It's just about showing that someone is there for them to listen, and that there is support available. If you don't have the confidence to do that, that's completely normal. It's just about kind of practicing, I guess, and taking it one step at a time. I will share lots of tips with you. You might not need to use them all, but it's just some things to get that conversation going. But what's really important is to remember what we said at the beginning, is that really simple act of listening and talking to somebody is really powerful in itself and can really significantly help somebody. So please don't put any pressure on yourself to kind of solve everybody's problems. So the first thing then, and it sounds obvious, but remember to ask the person how they're feeling and what's been going on. So sometimes when we're having a conversation with someone, we might say we've recognised that their behaviour has changed, and ask what's going on. They will talk through all the facts that have happened and why it's happened and what they're thinking of doing about it, but they might never actually say how they really feel. So, revealing those kind of emotions to whoever it is, however close that you are to them, really revealing those emotions can be kind of a huge relief to get them out. But sometimes we don't get asked how we're actually feeling. So just remember, if you're having a conversation with someone, ask how they feel, because them telling you how they feel can actually give you clues as well into what's actually going on or what they're really most worried about. So it's just really important to remember that kind of feeling question. And then check whether they know where to get help. So if somebody has been feeling low, whether it's for a short period of time or whether it's for a long period of time, it's probably a good idea for them to get some support. So that might be talking to their GP, or it might be getting some practical help from other organisations. It depends what they're going through, but it's really important that they do get some support. So if you're having that conversation with someone, asking questions like, have you talked to anybody else about this? Or do you want some help in looking for an organisation that can support you? They're things that we can help. So you're not expected to be the professional or the expert in that situation, but it's about just supporting that person to get the help that they do need. Use open questions. So often people do want to talk, but they wait until somebody asks how they are. And so the most helpful questions that someone can ask to help someone talk through their problems are open questions. And we probably all know what open questions are. So they're questions that don't end in kind of a yes or no or one word answer. So those are closed questions. So instead of closing that conversation down into kind of a yes, no response, by asking open questions, we're encouraging that person to keep talking and to think about how they're really feeling. So some examples of questions we can ask is, when did this start? Where did that happen? What else happened? How did that make you feel? So we're asking really kind of questions that they have to think about. They can't just say yes or no. They're having to think about, well, how did that actually make me feel? And use more in their response to that question, which will help them to process what they're going through. What I would say is just be careful with asking questions that start with why. So things like, why do you feel like that? Or why were you thinking about that? Sometimes people can become a bit defensive when they're asked a why question because it can come across as a little bit judgmental. Sometimes it's fine and people don't think that, but it's just thinking about that. And I'd say that's one of the most important things. I learned this kind of a few years ago, and it's really reframed the way that I speak to people. And instead of saying, why did you feel like that? I say something like, what made you feel like that? And it just comes across as a little bit softer and a bit more effective sometimes. So it's just something to think about and keep in mind when you are asking those questions. If you say the wrong thing, don't panic. So there is absolutely no perfect way to handle a difficult conversation. So, don't be too hard on yourself if it didn't go as well as you hoped. As long as you have shown that person that you care and you've shown compassion and made sure that person knows that they're not alone and they can talk, then you will have made a difference. It might be that you've signposted them somewhere else to get support. That's made a difference. So what I would say is just don't put too much pressure on yourself to have the perfect conversation, because we never know the way your conversation is going to go. And so it's equally as important to look after yourself and talk to somebody yourself as well, especially if you've had a difficult conversation or you're worried about somebody. then that can really affect you as well. So it's just important that you take time for yourself, do the things that you enjoy, that make you relaxed. And if you need to talk about what you've just heard from somebody, then find somebody that you can confide in. And that can be the Samaritans helpline as well, if you want to ring them. You know, like I said, it's all anonymous, so you can just talk about whatever you're feeling. And then finally, respect what that person tells you and don't pressure them. So often we'll find that we notice the signs that somebody is struggling. We ask them how they're doing, and we say we've noticed those signs. Ask them if they want to talk, and sometimes someone won't want to talk, and that's fine. You know, they might not be ready. So it's just really important that we don't push them. It's really easy for us to think, well, I want to fix the problem and I want to help, or I want to give advice. But if someone is not open to that, it's best to let them know that you are there for them. Let them know where they can get support, and then you might find that they come back to you, but they just need a bit of time to process that, but they'll still know that you're there for them and it will still have made a difference. So those are some tips around kind of how we can have that conversation. And then I'm going to talk about some more tips, but they are more about listening tips. So when I talk about Samaritans volunteers, all of our volunteers are trained to be good listeners. So it's a skill that we can all learn. You know, it's not something that we're necessarily just naturally good at. It's something that needs to build up. But that simple act of listening is so powerful. It can make a huge difference to people, just knowing that somebody is there to listen to what they're going through. So the first tip that we've got then is show that you care, which sounds obvious, but how do we show that we can care? So focus on that other person, you know, make sure that we're giving them our undivided attention, make eye contact, put away any distractions. So just make sure that you are really focused on that person, that they know that you're engaged and you're listening to them. Because I think we can often find that we're having a conversation and our phone goes, or something's happening over there and we're looking around, and that can sometimes come across as we're not really listening. So it's just really important to make sure that we're really focused in on that person. Have patience. So like I said, sometimes people won't want help straight away, and that's fine. It might take some time, and it might take a few attempts before somebody is really ready to open up. It might not be achieved in your first conversation, but those conversations, however many conversations you have, can be really helpful in building up that rapport and building up a compassionate interaction. So time is really key when we're listening to somebody. We don't want the person that we're talking to feel rushed. They don't want to feel like it's not a safe environment. So I think it's important to remember to give that person time, to make sure we've got time for that person as well. If you're offering to sit down and talk to somebody, make sure you have got the time. And one thing I think we all just naturally feel uncomfortable with is silences. So if you ask someone a question and they respond, but then there's a bit of a silence, what we would say is wait, you know, give that silence a little bit. It might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but that person might be thinking about how they want to articulate kind of their emotions or what they're going through. And sometimes the silence can actually encourage the person to expand on what they're saying. It will feel uncomfortable. I said that I think 3 times now because I know that it will feel uncomfortable, but remembering to use silence to your advantage can actually really help the conversation. We've said open questions. So again, when it comes to listening, open questions can be really useful. It's something our volunteers on the helpline use a lot, is asking open questions so the person can tell them more. And it just allows that person to, again, think a bit more about how they are feeling and what they're going through. Say it back. So this is about checking that we've understood what that other person is telling us. So we're not interrupting, we're not offering a solution, but we're literally just repeating something back to somebody after they told us it. So I know that might sound a bit odd, but it's really kind of a reassuring way to show that you've been listening to somebody, but it also gives you the opportunity to check that you have understood. So if somebody tells me something and I repeat it back to them, but it's not quite right, they've then got the opportunity to say, oh, no, I think you've misunderstood me there. This is actually what I've meant. And what it means is that you don't get to the end of the conversation and you've gone completely down different paths. You're not putting your own interpretation on it. You're just literally checking that you've understood what they're saying. But it can be really reassuring, because that person will then think, oh, they've really listened to what I've said, then they've really understood what I've said. And it'll, again, just allow you to kind of build that compassionate response. And then the final tip is have courage. So like I think I've already said, don't be put off by a negative response, and keep trying, not to a pushy extent. If the person's not ready, if the person doesn't want that support, you might know that they've got support somebody somewhere else. But I suppose have courage to start that conversation and just to check in on that person and let them know that you're there for them. We've got there as well, don't feel like you have to fill a silence, which I've already talked about, but that one's really important, to let kind of that person think about their thoughts. You know, we don't have to be constantly talking, can let those silences sit for a little bit just to see what comes out of them. And just to say, with all of this, it can feel really kind of intrusive and counterintuitive to ask someone what they're going through or how they feel. And it can feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes, especially if somebody doesn't want to engage with you on that level. But you will be surprised by how many people actually will open up, and sometimes it's just exactly what somebody needs to be able to share what's been going on for them. So try and have courage, but it does take time, and if it's new to you, then it will take some time, but go over these tips. I'll share a resource in a second when all of these tips are included. And, you know, practice listening with people, practice some of these things, have a think about how good you already are at these things, because I'm sure you're already quite compassionate. It's just about kind of having these tips to allow you to get the most out of conversations with people. One way that you can remember the tips that I have shared with you is by using the acronym SHUSH, so SHUSH. So just to go back through them to demonstrate that: show you care, have patience, use open questions, say it back, and have courage. And I like this. The simple act of listening is powerful and can make a huge difference. When people feel listened to, it can save a life, and it really can. You know, sometimes people think listening is really simple, but there's a lot to it, and it can really, really help people. So I would encourage you to think about this, think about showing compassion, show compassion to yourself as well. I think that's really important. And if you want to know more about working kind of with compassion, showing compassion, we have got a full resource, which all the information I've shared today is included in this resource. It's called Working with Compassion, and it is on our Samaritans website. So if you go on there and you just type in Working with Compassion, and it is a full toolkit which is designed to help people develop more compassionate approaches. So the idea behind it is that it improves interactions with people and improves those outcomes from those conversations. And it's got lots of signposting in the back of it as well, lots of organisations that you can signpost to, or that you might find useful for yourself to use if you need support with anything. If you do need support for yourself, or you know somebody who is struggling to cope, we've got another resource which is called Finding Your Way, and that is designed as a toolkit for anybody who's struggling to cope, they're self-harming or they're feeling suicidal. So that includes anybody who's just noticed a dip in their well-being, or if they're feeling lonely or isolated. There's lots of information in there about what that might look like for people, but also where to get support. And we've also got self-harm and suicide safety plans in there, which can be helpful if somebody is having thoughts or acting on thoughts of self-harm or suicide. So again, I've got the link in the slide, and I can share these, but you can just go on our website and type in Finding Your Way, and that will come up. And it's all in English and Welsh, so whichever you prefer. So I'm just going to finish off with a short clip from a man called Ollie. So we've got lots of these on our website. Ollie was involved in a campaign called Real People, Real Stories, where we asked people to share their experiences of mental health and suicidal feelings and how they came out to the other side of that. So I just thought it'd be a nice way to finish the presentation for you to see kind of what can be done when people ask for help. So hopefully this works. I have shared my sound, but please somebody let me know if if you can't hear it.
I have struggled with depression and anxiety since I was 15, maybe before that. And then early last year, for months I could feel that it had been building up, and like my anxiety was getting worse than it had ever been. I was getting more depressed than I'd ever been. I'd had a lot of changes happen in my life, and then I went for a breakup, and I think it was just the straw that broke the camel's back, and I got really, really poorly, and I didn't know what else to do. I didn't see another way out. I thought that there would be only one way out, and that would be to end my own life. I started seeing a counsellor. And part of my therapy for her was for me to talk to people about it. So I went to the pub. There was 10 of us, just all my closest mates, all boys. And I said, I've been really quiet for the last couple of weeks. I said, look, lads, the reason I've been so quiet, the reason I haven't been going out so much, is because I've been really depressed and struggling really badly with anxiety. And literally 4 of them put their test around. They're like, oh yeah, mate, so have I. I know how that feels. Like, I've seen a counsellor. Instantly, then I'm like, right, so I'm not the only one. This isn't a weird thing. Like, I should have talked about this sooner. We all should have talked about this sooner. And now we have such a close friendship, and probably closer than we were before, because we all talk about it. Really, what I want to do is to help people realise that it's okay, that you don't feel that great at the moment, but there definitely is a way out, and you definitely can get better.
I really like that video because it does really show that there is options for people, and talking about it can really help. And sometimes it shows you that other people are going through similar things that you didn't know about, and that can offer you a space to talk about it as well. If you want to see more videos like that or read more stories, there's a web page that we've got on the Samaritans website called Stories of Hope, and there's lots of nice stories on there about people who have felt either suicidal, or they've self-harmed, or they've felt in emotional distress, but they have sought different various kind of types of support, and they've come out the other end of it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we've got about 6 minutes left for any questions, if anybody has got anything. I think you can pop those on the Q&A box, or there's a chat box as well, which you can have a look at. So if anybody has got any questions, I'm going to pop my email address in the chat box as well. So if anybody had any questions afterwards that you wanted to ask, or any other information that you need, then please feel free to email me. There we go. Can't see any questions, so I'll give it another minute. But if you haven't got any questions, just thank you so much for coming today and listening to the talk. I'm more than happy to send through the slides and any links that I've shared, so you can have a little look, and you can have a look at those resources as well. But I would encourage you to have a little look at our website, because we've got loads of things on there. Please could you mind listening to the telephone number? Yeah, of course. So it's 116, put it in here, 123. And then if I just I'll get my slides, and I'll share the Welsh one as well. The Welsh number is 0808 164 0123, which I should know off by heart, but it's not as easy to remember as 123. Someone's asked about volunteering. So brilliant that you'd like to become a volunteer. If you would like to become a volunteer, you can go on our website, and there'll be a link there for those who are interested in volunteering. There's various different roles. So you can become a listening volunteer, and you can help on the helpline. Or if you prefer to do some other things with Samaritans, different branches have different volunteering roles. So it will depend where the local branch to you is. but they have fundraising roles, they have community outreach opportunities. You can also do things like admin support for the branch. So you can go on our website, have a look at that, type in where your local branch is, and then there'll be an application form that you fill out with some questions. And then there will be an interview process. If you want to become a listening volunteer, the volunteering training is initially about 6-7 weeks, because it is quite intense, because there's a lot of important skills that you need to learn, and then you do lots of skills practice, and you have support throughout your time volunteering then, to make sure that you're okay and that you have the skills that you need to become a listener. Thank you, everyone. Well, I hope you have a really nice weekend, enjoyable. And yeah, like I said, if you've got any other questions that you don't want to ask now, please feel free to email me.